What needs to be born? I think that's what we're talking about today. Back in high school, my journalism teacher was a bit of a cynic, I would say. She was kind of a character, actually. She lived with another woman, she rode a motorcycle, and she sang with a group called the Sweet Adelines, a women's barbershop quartet. She did kind of a mean version of me and Bobby McGee on the ukulele, accompanying herself. I'll never forget my high school years. And on the wall of our classroom, she had placed a poster to inspire the high school newspaper staff. It was based on the Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, If you've heard this poem, you know the one, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, then yours is the earth and everything in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Sound familiar to anyone? Anyone who took high school English? Yeah, a few of us. Her version of this was a little different though. The poster said, if you can keep your head about you when all those around you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, then you obviously do not know what the hell is going on. Right about now, many of us are trying to keep our heads, and we feel like we don't know what the heck is going on. Will you pray with me, please? Holy One, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. You are our rock and our Redeemer. So this idea of keeping your head about you when all around you things are falling apart is not a new problem. Over the millennia, there have been many times that challenge people to keep their calm when everything seemed to be going to pieces. These are the times that try men's soul, Thomas Paine famously wrote during the Revolutionary War. The times that try men's soul. But I prefer something from the book of Esther. I think the expression is, for such a time as this, for such a time as this, we were born. Now, if you study history, you know crises are nothing new. Just in our American history, we've been through the Civil War, World War I and II, the chaos of the Vietnam era, McCarthyism, which I thought about recently, Jim Crow, lynchings, slavery, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl. This is just to name a few. And if there's anything comforting about reading history, it puts our own time into perspective. The Gospel of Mark was written for such a time of crisis. It was written around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, the temple was a huge structure, an imposing, magnificent building that symbolized the gathering of the Jewish people, the centralization of worship after hundreds of years, and the ascendance of a particular type of Judaism. The temple building stood for order, certainty, and strength. It was hugely symbolic and huge in its proportions, built atop a mountain with tall golden doors. So no wonder the disciples in this morning's reading were in awe. What large stones and large buildings, they remarked to Jesus. It reminds me a little bit of like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. My, you know, what a great city we've arrived in. They are awed by the grandeur and proportions of the temple. But Jesus tells them, don't be too impressed. All these stones will be thrown down, and you will be left with a big pile of rubble. Now, I went to the National Building Museum when I was up in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago. And this is, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but to me, that's an impressive building. I was awed by this building. It was built right after the Civil War to accommodate the need for all these widows and orphans and veterans who needed pensions. So they built this huge office building. Do you have the next? Yeah, isn't that incredible interior? A place where they could, and that is a museum today, but imagine the buildings that we humans have built. Yeah, there's one more view of it from before. Thanks, Gail. And in Chattanooga, I noticed the other day on my walk, when I get a nice vista of the city at one point on the walk, that our tallest buildings have names like Truist, Pinnacle, and First Horizon. Showing, I think, what we human beings tend to value most of all. What large stones and large buildings we humans create. Yet Jesus' words confront us with the truth that nothing lasts. Not even those things we consider to be most permanent. His words remind me of the Buddhist concept that to understand impermanence, we can imagine everything we treasure, value, and consider to be very solid as already broken. Jesus tells the disciples of a coming time of false messiahs. False messiahs, who would have thought that could ever happen? Earthquakes, famines, wars, and rumors of war. We might as well add hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and rumors of some changing government policies coming to a country near you. Yet Jesus says words that may come as a surprise to the disciples and to us at a time like this. Jesus says, "Do not be alarmed when you see these things." Do not be alarmed. Or as Luke's gospel puts it, because the story's in 3 of the gospels, do not be terrified. Or as Matthew says, see that you are not alarmed. Some of us may have felt a bit alarmed these past few weeks. And some of us may feel like we're losing our faith in some of the institutions that we have held dear. Perhaps certain illusions we've had are beginning to crumble. Yet Jesus gives these words, "For such a time as this, do not be terrified." In her sermon collection, God in Pain, famous preacher and Episcopal priest Barbara Brown Taylor argues that, get this, disillusionment is essential to the Christian life. Disillusionment is literally the loss of an illusion about ourselves, about the world, about God, about our country. While it is almost always a painful thing, it is never a bad thing to lose the lies that we have mistaken for the truth. End of quote. So let that sink in a moment. It's never a bad thing, she says, to lose the lies we have mistaken for the truth. And I would add that only after you have lost your illusions can you truly act in service to love. In 2016, social activist Adrienne Maree Brown wrote the following in reference to racial injustice and the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement. She wrote, quote, "Things are not getting worse, they are getting uncovered. We must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil." As some chaotic and destructive forces continue to reveal themselves, some dark times may indeed be ahead. Institutions we trust may be under threat. And I would say this is just the time to hold each other tight. This is just the time to stand side by side as witnesses. Jesus calls on his disciples, and he calls on us to be aware, to be vigilant, but not to live in fear. Keep watch, keep grounded in reality, be aware, but not overwhelmed. When the record producer Quincy Jones died 2 days before the election, many of the obituaries quoted him as saying, "Every day you have to make a choice between love and fear. As much as you can, choose love." So you'll notice in our scripture reading that Jesus never does get around to answering the disciples' question about precisely when are these things going to come to pass? When is the end of the world going to happen? Instead of answering their question, instead he sets out for them a way to live in the midst of turmoil. So much more useful, right? A turmoil that returns to human life again and again in cycles that repeat and have repeated throughout the millennia. So a way to live. A therapist friend of mine recently shared with me an image of the human nervous system. I'm not a doctor or a therapist, but just, I'm taking her word for it. She said the human nervous system can be thought of as a ladder. At the base of the ladder is a place where we feel trapped, immobilized, or shut down. She called that place collapse. Many of us may have visited collapse in the last few weeks. Raise your hand if you were there at some point. Yes. As we climb the ladder, we are able to take action. Our nervous system is activated, but we're still somehow in fight or flight. We're still reacting. We're still stressed. And then she talked about a place at the top of the ladder, a place called ventral vagal, where we feel safe and calm. And she argued that only from that place can we connect with others and engage with wisdom. So y'all may be on all different rungs of that ladder today, or may have been in the past. But the sooner we can bring ourselves back to the place of inner peace and security, the more easily we can begin to support one another and be ready for the work ahead. One essayist put it this week, "Things may seem to fall apart. It may appear that anarchy has been loosed on the world. Nevertheless," quoting T.S. Eliot here, "the center will hold, and much to our amazement, we will discover that we, all of us, have much faithful work to do." We have work to do to support one another, to support the vulnerable of this world, and to prepare for what may happen, witnessing love in the midst of any kind of confusion or despair. So our gospel reading this morning ends with a statement from Jesus. Did you notice this? It's almost like it's not even the end of the sentence, I don't think, but it just ends this lectionary reading for this Sunday. When these things take place, this is the beginning of the birth pangs. It's not the end, it's the beginning of the birth pangs. And birth pangs is an image that at least some of us can relate to. No fun at all, in my view. But the awful pain is often compensated by the delight in meeting a healthy newborn baby. It's such a study in contrast, it's such an experience. From great pain and suffering emerges this new life. So when temples are destroyed, when things fall apart, stay with what's happening, Jesus seems to say. Stay with what's happening because something is trying to be born. Valerie Carr has written, and Brian McLaren has repeated her thought that from darkness, from chaos, from destruction, something new can emerge. In fact, that may be the only way that something new can come into the world. The darkness of the tomb could be the darkness of the womb. And the Christian story is always one of life, death, and rebirth with transformed life. So what is going to emerge from the current situation? Emily Towns, a well-known professor from my time at Yale, who is now dean at Vanderbilt, has written about the passage we read this morning. The time of destruction, which is an ending, is also a beginning for people of deep faith. So where is God calling you to stand in the turmoil? How will you be a midwife at this birth? And how will you bring comfort in the midst of the birth pangs? What role can this pilgrim church play? These are the questions for us to be pondering now, as soon as we can get off the bottom of the ladder and back where we belong. What's happening, Jesus promises at the end of this week's gospel reading, is not death, but birth. Something is waiting to be born. Yes, we are called to bear witness with love in the ruins, but rest assured, these birth pangs will end in new life. Amen.